On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to be taking a look at a discovery of astronomical proportions. We have the man who made the discovery with us on today's program. It's going to be about the lunar and solar eclipses in the year 2015, the sabbatical year 2015. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me and with our guest this fascinating subject. Gary, introduce our guest, please.
Be glad to, J.R. Today, signs in the heavens, the sun, the moon. And with us, Pastor Mark Biltz, El Shaddai Ministries of Bonnie Lake, Washington. And Mark, welcome to Prophecy in the News. Tell us a little about your work there in Bonnie Lake. Where is Bonnie Lake, and what's your congregation like?
Sure. Bonnie Lake is just outside of Tacoma, Washington. It would be the city most people are familiar with. And I started the congregation 7 years ago to teach Hebrew roots to Christians. I just really felt it was important that they had a better understanding of the roots. We're grafted into a tree, and we need to go down to the deepest part we can to get the richness of that root. We have about 200 people now. We're doing a Passover Seder this year of over 600 people in the Tacoma Dome. And we're very excited about what God is doing in teaching all of us about Hebrew roots and his feast days.
Very good. Well, J.R., I must say, it's knowing where to start today. We could talk about so many different things. But you've made an amazing discovery. And it started February 21st, basically. You got an insight at the time of a blood moon. And there's a very famous photo that's been circulating around of a blood moon over the Dome of the Rock, an eclipse of the moon. And that proved to be very much a stimulus for your thinking.
Yes, it did. I was looking at that, and I thought the Bible had talked about how the moon would turn to blood and the sun would turn to sackcloth before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And so I thought, well, the plain meaning of the text, it would be a total solar eclipse and a total lunar eclipse. So I thought, well, our government, NASA, the Goddard Space Center, has a website, and it lists all of the eclipses for the last, 5,000 years, and the next 2,000 years. Because when God placed the sun, the moon, and the stars in the skies, he's very organized, he's mathematical, very precise. And they can determine exactly when they have occurred. So I went to the website.
Now, in Genesis 1:14,
yes,
when God put the stars in the heavens for signs, tell us about the Hebrew word there for the signs.
Yes,
okay.
The Hebrew word for signs is ot, and it means a signal. Kind of like one if by land, two if by sea. It's like God wants to signal us, send a signal to us, if we're watching the signal. And the Hebrew word implies, if you look it up in your Strong's Concordance, not only is it a signal, but it's a signal for coming or his appearing. And the word season, he also said, they're not only for signs, but for seasons. Well, when we think seasons in our normal mindset, we're thinking winter, spring, summer, fall.
Yes.
But the Hebrew word is the moed, which refers directly to the festivals of the Messiah. It literally means a divine appointment. When we hear the word feast, we think food. But the Hebrew word has nothing to do with food. It has to do with a divine appointment, as if God has a day timer. And he says, okay, I'm going to mark the day and the time when I'm going to signal my appearings.
Amazing. You know, the idea of the blood moon and the solar eclipse and lunar eclipses, down through history, many of the ancient profane historians, I say profane because they're not religious, okay? I'm talking about Roman historians, Greek historians, when a general goes out with his troops to war, there are oftentimes written in the history of this world, on a certain day there was a solar eclipse, the sun turned dark, and a certain night there was a blood moon when the moon went out. And these are time markers that help historians to find out when those particular events took place. For example, Flavius Josephus said that shortly after Herod was ill, some Jews got up on the temple door and pulled down the golden eagle and chopped it to pieces. Well, Herod was so angry, he had these men burned at the stake, and that night there was a solar eclipse over Jerusalem. So, you know, this is really fascinating that these are time markers historically and have historically been used in historical writings that they are very significant.
Definitely.
Now, I want us to go to the year 2014-2015 for the first set of eclipses, because there are 4 lunar eclipses and 2 solar eclipses in that one year, and they just happen to be on Jewish holy days. So, let's go, for example, to these heavenly signs and look at them here. The sabbatical year of 2014-2015. It begins on September 25th, 2014, ends September 13th, 2015. And the first that we want to see are a series of 4 lunar eclipses. And we have the lunar eclipse there of one of them. As you can see, I've speeded up the movie there from our astronomy program in the computer. You see how it's turned blood red. Now, it says Passover, April 15, 2014, Tabernacles, October 8, 2014. Then the following Passover, April 4, 2015. The following Tabernacles, September 28, 2015. Tell us about that.
Well, what's fascinating is when you look at the Gregorian calendar, you see April 15th, October 8th, April 4th, September 28th. You don't see a pattern. But on the biblical calendar, the Passover is the same day. Sukkot is the same day.
Yeah.
And so God wants us to look at the biblical calendar. Mm-hmm. That's what we need to be watching. The reason we need to be watching is so He will signal His appearing. But we have to know what to be watching as well. And so we need to be watching the biblical holidays.
So Passover occurs on a full moon.
Yes.
And naturally, the moon has to be on a full moon for the shadow of the earth to come between the moon and the sun and create this shadow across the surface of the moon. And we just happen to have that in Passover in the year 2015. Now, that is a sabbatical year. It's 7 years from now.
Okay? Yes.
We also had this on the Feast of Tabernacles, which is Tishri 15 in the autumn. The full moon following the new moon of September, or Rosh Hashanah.
Yes.
So on Tishri 15, there is the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, as it's called in Hebrew.
Yes.
And we have another solar eclipse. That's in 2014. Then the following year, 2015, and by the way, Rosh Hashanah 2014 begins the sabbatical year.
Yes, yes.
Because,
Correct.
It takes two of our numberings to find one 12-month period, because the Jewish New Year begins with the new moon of September and goes for 3 months into our next year and then 9 months of that year.
Right.
So when we say it begins in 2014, ends in 2015, we're talking 12 months, okay? 1 year. But we have the Passover and Feast of Tabernacles eclipse in 2014, and then in 2015, we have the same thing all over again. Now, how often does that happen in history?
I'm glad you asked that. That doesn't happen that often in history. When I went to the government's website, they said on there, any of you can go there, that when you have 4 total blood red moons back to back, it's called a tetrad. And some centuries, for 400 years, there were no tetrads. This didn't happen at all. And so I looked to see in this century how many tetrads there were. And there were 6 or 7. But what's interesting, the only one that it happens on the 4 biblical holidays is 2014, 2015. It doesn't happen again. In this century, you were going to find 4 blood red moons on the biblical holidays. So the fact that it doesn't happen again in this century, I think, is very significant. So then I looked at last century. Mm-hmm. And believe it or not, the last time that 4 blood red moons occurred together was in 1967 and 1968, tied to Jerusalem recaptured by Israel.
The 6-day war. Isn't that amazing, Gary?
Well, that's more than amazing. Now, what we have here, and don't be confused, this is really simpler than it sounds. The Lord seems to be marking dates with signs.